In all of our previous lectures on the Latin Middle Ages, we've seen how the centers of learning and institutions were mostly church-sponsored, and how the people who did natural philosophy were generally theologians as well. These were the same people. They were overlapping professions, if you will. We don't want to think about them as professions in the modern sense, because that kind of professionalism is a much later development for science. Well, in this lecture, we're going to look specifically at two new orders that develop in the Middle Ages, in the 13th century. What will be of interest is to notice their divergent attitudes towards the study of the natural world. Now, monastic centers had been places of learning, places to preserve learning, since the downfall of antique culture. Particularly the Benedictine order, with its mostly rural monasteries, they functioned as preservers of technological and scientific, literary, intellectual culture in general. But the High Middle Ages saw the emergence of two new orders, known as mendicant orders, literally begging orders, because of a commitment to poverty. These were the Franciscans and the Dominicans. Now, both orders begin at just about the same time. Their founders, St. Dominic and St. Francis, were contemporaries. Let's start with St. Dominic. St. Dominic was born in Spain about 1170, died in 1221. He created an order of preachers. Their mission was to preach effectively, both to strengthen the church and to confront and confound heretical movements. And the 13th century saw quite a number of heretical movements developing within the church. The Dominicans grew extremely fast. By the end of the 13th century, so that's within 100 years, there were about 12,000 Dominicans in Europe, and they lived in something like 600 convents. Very soon, they became the intellectual elite of the Christian church. Now, the followers of St. Francis of Assisi, St. Francis being born in Italy, in the town of Assisi in Umbria in 1186. He dies about the same time as St. Dominic, a little bit later, in 1226. His followers, the Friars Minor, as they were called, sought a renewal of Christian piety through the embrace of a simple life devoted to poverty, to charity, and to communal living. So there's some difference in the two orders right away from the beginning. Both had some things in common, however. They were organized under a central leadership, and in this they differ markedly from earlier orders, from truly monastic orders, like the Benedictines and the Augustinians, that had largely independent centers. This meant that the Franciscans and the Dominicans were, in a sense, pan-European, organized under a central administration. Made them very effective in responding to things and into centralizing ideas. By the end of the 14th century, both of them had become powerful intellectual forces and maintained high profiles in the universities. Now, the Dominicans first got a chair at Paris in 1229 and got a second one in 1231. So the Dominicans immediately set up a very close relationship to the University of Paris. In fact, the order recognized only the degrees that came from Paris. In 1248, they expanded to Oxford and to Cologne and to other cities. In fact, they actually, in 1250, set up an Arabic school, a Schola Arabica, in Tunis, in North Africa, which is quite a remarkable thing, actually. The Franciscans originally, according to St. Francis's teaching, eschewed education or positions of learning. But that very soon changed. The Franciscans themselves had to deal with heretical movements within the Franciscan order, as well as without the Franciscan order. And so they, too, rapidly attached themselves to universities, a little bit later than the Dominicans, but with no less fervor eventually. This is quite contrary to what St. Francis wanted. In fact, throughout much of the later 13th century, mid-13th century, there's a tremendous struggle at the university between the secular teachers and the mendicants. This is partially because the universities were based on a guild structure, but the mendicants were outside of that guild structure, and so the seculars felt that they weren't getting a fair break with the mendicants. The secular masters had to teach in order to make a living, whereas the mendicants were supported with stipends that came from the order themselves. The secular masters had to abide by more rules of the universities than these outsiders, these Dominicans and Franciscans. And so there was quite some heated debate between the two groups. In fact, some of the masters began to question the real validity of a life dedicated to poverty. Is this really in keeping with Christianity or not? And so these arguments over poverty were partially an outgrowth of the uncertainty or the dislike, I should say, of the mendicant orders at the universities. Well, in order to talk about the natural philosophies that were followed by the mendicant orders, I've decided to choose one example from each side, one Franciscan and one Dominican. Now, obviously, we're going to miss a huge amount of material by concentrating on just two characters, because clearly one person can't exemplify an entire order. Nonetheless, I've chosen two contemporaries that will allow me to play off the two orders against one another in terms of the history of science and their contributions thereto. The first one I'm going to start with is the Dominican example, and this is Albert the Great, Albertus Magnus, called the Universal Doctor. He's widely hailed in his own time and shortly after as the most learned man of the Middle Ages. Undoubtedly, he was hailed as the most learned man of his time, presumably mostly by people in his own order, one would expect. Nonetheless, his learning was extremely wide. He was a Bavarian by birth, was born about 1200, lived until 1280. A tremendously prolific writer, important teacher in the early Dominican order. Well, he studied first at Padua in Italy. Then he became a Dominican, and eventually he went to the University of Paris about 1241, where he became the very first German master of theology there. And he lectured on theology from 1245 until 1248. Then he left the University of Paris to found a new studium generale, a new school, a new university, if you will, in 1248 in Cologne. Now, he had some important students. Perhaps most important among them was St. Thomas Aquinas himself. Well, for our purposes, what's most interesting about St. Albert the Great was that at the request of the Dominicans, he undertook to write a massive paraphrase and commentary on all of Aristotle, including all of the Arabic commentaries on Aristotle. Now, in a modern edition, this takes up 17 large volumes on a library shelf, so a massive amount of writing. It was, in fact, Albert's work, to a large extent, that thoroughly established Aristotelian thought and works at Paris and elsewhere. He probably did more than any other single person to propagate Aristotelianism in the 13th century. Well, as one would expect, his writings are therefore deeply Aristotelian throughout, and he argues that logic, meaning, of course, Aristotle's logic, should be the basis of all study. Now, don't go away with the thought that Albert blindly followed Aristotle in everything. He also compiled, in addition to this paraphrase and commentary on Aristotle, a list of Aristotle's errors. And he argued very clearly that mere authority was never enough to bring an argument to a successful conclusion. What one has to know are the true causes of things, the true causes of things. Now, his methodology for natural philosophy includes a substantial amount of empirical work, presumably some experimental work, and observation. Observation is key to a lot of what Albert does. And he writes profusely on natural philosophical topics in a wide range. For example, he wrote one book on each of the three realms of nature: vegetable, animal, and mineral. His De Vegetabilibus is a wide-ranging comparative study of plants. He looks at parts of plants and how plants, what they're good for, what they're useful for, where they grow, what their parts are. And similarly, his De Animalibus looks at animals in the same way. One of his most noteworthy achievements, in fact, in the De Animalibus on animals was the content on embryology and reproduction. He probably did more than anyone else in the Middle Ages, even more than Aristotle did classically, to look at the reproduction of animals and embryology in animals. He also wrote a work on minerals, De Mineralibus, which classifies minerals. He lists mineral after mineral and talks about their properties, how they react in the fire, what they're good for, what they look like, and that sort of thing. And he also studied fossils, one of the first people to study fossils, the imprint of earlier life forms in rocks. And Albert was involved in a debate as to whether these were actually the signs of living creatures or whether they were non-living things that just happened to look like living creatures. In fact, he concluded that they were ludi naturae, that is, games or sports of nature. It was just nature producing something that happened to look like a living form, not actually a living one. He also wrote on the rainbow, he wrote on comets, he wrote on the tides, and even composed a commentary on Euclid's Elements. So, does all kinds of things. He, like many of his contemporaries, argued that the study of the natural world leads directly to a glorification of God. Remember, when we're looking at natural philosophical topics, we can't forget the reasons why they were carried out. And throughout the Middle Ages, these are theological reasons. However, one should also mention, to be complete, that Albert says in one of his writings that besides glorifying God, he's done all this work to satisfy the curiosity of my students. Now, presumably, read between the lines, I'm sure it's Albert's own curiosity. One would not have gone to the extent that St. Albert did for other people's curiosity. I'm sure his own was just as important, if not more so. Just in passing, as we leave Albert the Great, I should mention one part of Albert's afterlife. Namely, he was canonized on the 16th of December in 1931. And 10 years later, in 1941, he was declared the patron saint of natural scientists. So sort of recognition, very late recognition of his work in the Middle Ages. Well, now let's move away from the Dominicans and look at, instead, the Franciscans. And the exemplar I've chosen for that is Roger Bacon, called the Marvelous Doctor. Most medieval writers, theologians got titles. Just as Albert was called the Universal Doctor, Bacon was called the Marvelous Doctor. He was an English Franciscan, keenly interested in natural philosophy, but in ways very different from Albert the Great, and for very different reasons. Now, let me just say a little bit about his biography. He received a Master of Arts degree about 1240 and lectured in Paris on Aristotle from about 1241 to 1246. So he overlapped at Paris with Albert the Great. They were there at the same time. Whether they actually knew each other or not, we don't know, but they may have done. We know that he also lectured on the Libri Naturales, that is, the books of Aristotle dealing with natural philosophy, the physics, on meteors, on animals, that sort of thing. He returned to Oxford and became a Franciscan in 1257. And then he underwent, I don't know, call it a midlife crisis, if you will, at least a midlife conversion. Conversion not of religion, but of philosophy, from an Aristotelian to a Neoplatonist. And as a result, he adopted the Neoplatonic light metaphysics that people like Robert Grosseteste, that we talked about in a previous lecture, that Bishop of Lincoln, that light metaphysics, where light was a central part of the way knowledge comes to us and the way God creates the world and the way change occurs in the world. As a result, Bacon argued strongly that mathematics, not logic, as Albert would say, should be the basis of all studies. In fact, he calls mathematics the first of the sciences, the alphabet of philosophy, the door and key to the sciences. He's clearly very much interested in mathematics. Now, why? Well, Bacon's thought depended upon an idea which is called the multiplication of species. That doesn't have to do with animal reproduction the way it sounds. It's something very different. That is, the means of causation, the means of change, they propagate radially from one object to another, like the propagation of light. Now, that may be a little hard to understand. Let me spend a minute or two talking about exactly what he means. Well, let me read what he says in one of his works. An agent directs its effects to making the recipient similar to itself, because the recipient is always potentially what the agent is in actuality. So, for example, a vessel of cold water placed near the fire but not in the fire gradually becomes hot. That is, the fire extends its own quality of hotness radially towards the water. The water is the recipient of that ray, and it becomes like the fire. In other words, hot. So the quality of fire is multiplied in the water. Now, this multiplication of species propagates the way light propagates. And since light can be treated mathematically, that means that all causation can be treated mathematically too. So that means all change in the world can be treated mathematically. Bacon says every multiplication is according to lines, angles, or figures. So clearly mathematics is the center of his natural philosophy. So this leads him into a comprehensive analysis of the laws of behavior of light, of radiation, reflection and refraction in particular. Now, the background to this is certainly Grosseteste and his interest in light. We don't know how much interaction the two had. Sometimes said that Bacon was Grosseteste's student. That doesn't seem to be the case on further study. We don't know, but certainly there's some interaction there, whether through text or by word of mouth. But ultimately, Bacon's ideas on the multiplication of species come from a much older source. They come from Al-Kindi. Remember him? The 9th century Baghdad philosopher. He envisioned the world as a vast network of rays emanating from every object and affecting in turn every object. This, in fact, is a basis of astrology. It's why astrology works. The planets send us light, but an influence comes along with that light. And unlike light, according to Bacon, the influences can penetrate opaque objects. We know, for example, if we put an opaque object, a brick, let's say, in front of a fire, the backside of the brick, even though it remains dark, becomes warm. So that action must be propagated through an opaque substance. Or a magnet, a lodestone that is a native mineral that has magnetic properties, can extend its magnetic virtues through solid objects. Well, Bacon wrote 3 important works, the Opus Maius, the greater work, the Opus Minor, the lesser work, and then a supplementary Opus Tertium, a 3rd work, not very inventive titles. Nonetheless, these were written at the request of Pope Clement IV. They were requested in 1266. Bacon wrote them quickly and sent them off in 1267, and unfortunately the Pope died in 1268 without giving Bacon a response. We have this problem of popes dying suddenly all the time. These works touch on just about every aspect of natural philosophy and education. Again, mathematics and optics are central. Bacon writes about magnifying lenses and about burning mirrors and other topics. In fact, he mentioned someone he met in France by the name of Peter of Maricourt, also called Peter Peregrinus, who was working on a mirror that using sunlight could burn objects at a distance. This same Peter also wrote the first comprehensive treatise on the lodestone, on the magnet in the Latin West. Bacon also emphasizes something else besides mathematics: the need to know foreign languages. This is absolutely key because there's lots of knowledge out there, says he, and we have to be able to get it. In fact, he himself, Bacon that is, wrote Greek and Hebrew grammars. He suggested a correction of the calendar, that we should add one day every 125 years, which in fact what was done several centuries later on when the calendar was reformed in the 16th century. Bacon has been celebrated for an experimental approach to knowledge, that we can find out about the world by carrying out experiments. And in fact, that's true. We don't actually know sometimes how much of the experiments he actually carried out physically and how many of them were thought experiments, but nonetheless, he does promote the need to experiment on the world. He's also the first person to mention gunpowder in the West, which he announces by an anagram, a code. So he doesn't actually give the proportions of how to make it, but he does seem to know of its existence. He talks about a powder that wrapped up in a little bit of paper and ignited will make a sound louder than the most powerful thunder. Now, Bacon was imprisoned for a time. Why? Well, Franciscans were not allowed to publish without permission, which he in fact did do. Now, why would he actually go to prison over this? It wasn't actually the Franciscans trying to squelch knowledge or the pursuit of knowledge or natural philosophy. The real reason is much more interesting, because Bacon's natural philosophical and educational work was motivated by very deep concerns over major threats that the church was going to face, which is why his works went to the Pope, went directly to the Pope instead of going through the superior general of his order as they should have done. Part of his fears were about Mongols and Muslims. Now, the Mongols were becoming a threat. They sacked Baghdad during Bacon's life. In fact, the Pope had sent Franciscans as emissaries to the Great Khan in Mongolia in 1245, and they were there until 1247. Bacon recognized that Christians were a minority in the world. And so, with the expansion of European horizons, the church needed more persuasive arguments against the infidels in order to convert them. And science, therefore, would strengthen Christendom by knowing more about the natural world. But there was a greater fear than the Mongols and the Muslims, and this was the Antichrist. Bacon thought the Antichrist was about to appear, and scientific knowledge, according to him, would provide the best weapons for Christianity against the horrid assaults of the Antichrist. He talks, for example, about making mirrors and refractive and reflective lenses that could spy on enemy camps at a great distance. This would help us know when the Antichrist was drawing near. Well, this ties in to the heretical movements within the Franciscan order that I alluded to previously. In the 13th century, the Franciscans were struggling to suppress the radical spiritualist branch of their order. This spiritualist branch was caught up in an apocalyptic frenzy, a prophetic frenzy about the coming of the Antichrist. This basically made the Franciscans look bad. Theologians and church administrators tend to look rather dubiously upon people wandering around the countryside being prophets of the end of the world. And so the Franciscan order was trying to suppress this branch. And so Bacon's concerns about the coming of the Antichrist must surely have linked him to this spiritual branch, rendered him suspect, and that's probably the real background behind his trial and imprisonment. Well, Let me now sum up something about the medieval Franciscans and Dominicans. First of all, they didn't necessarily get along particularly well. Bacon, on the one hand, strongly criticized the Dominicans, Albert and Thomas Aquinas in particular. He criticized their educational methods, and he criticized their Aristotelian innovations. He preferred instead, like many Franciscans, like St. Bonaventure, who was head of the order for a while, he preferred Neo-Augustinian thought, that is, thought based on a revival of St. Augustine's thought, which is in fact what? Well, remember Augustine, it's Christianized Platonism and Neoplatonism. So the Franciscans, speaking in very broad general terms, preferred a more Platonic, Neoplatonic view of nature. The Dominicans favored, on the other hand, more strictly Aristotelian methods. So now here's something interesting's come up. Here, 2,000 years after Plato and Aristotle disagreed with one another, these two mendicant orders in the 13th century continue the argument. The Franciscans choose Plato through Augustine. They choose a mathematical, Pythagorean approach to nature, whereas the Dominicans choose Aristotle with a qualitative, logical, non-mathematical approach to the world. Well, many members of both orders made important contributions to both natural philosophy and to theology, and they had an enormous impact on university culture as well. Well, I'd like to end this lecture by recounting a little anecdote to you of something I saw that affected me very deeply. This was when I was traveling through northern Italy in the town of Bolzano. In the town of Bolzano, I wandered into a small Franciscan church. It was not one of the great churches of the city. It was small but very dignified and beautiful. And what I saw there on the walls was a decoration that says a lot about Franciscan intellectual culture and the position of intellectuals in the medieval church. All along one wall, stretching from one end of the nave to the other, was a single continuous fresco containing about 24 figures. Well, who were they? They weren't apostles looking down at us. They weren't saints looking down on us. They were not figures from the Bible to tell us stories from the Old or New Testament. Rather, what I saw there in a rank were Franciscan professors. Only one of them a canonized saint, the rest of them just professors, all of them labeled underneath by name and title. The Venerable Doctor, Godfrey of Fontaine, the Solid Doctor, Richard of Middleton, the Illuminated Doctor, the Irrefrangible Doctor, the Subtle Doctor, the Seraphic Doctor. And on they went. Now, what were they doing in this fresco? Were they just standing there looking out at us? No, they paid no attention to the people who were looking at them. Instead, they were grouped in twos and threes with their hands upraised, books often in one hand or the other, disputing with one another, carrying on that crucial part of university medieval culture, the disputation. And here they are arguing with one another over presumably subtle points of theology, maybe of natural philosophy, there on the walls of this church. So, here in this 15th century fresco in the Franciscan church in Bolzano, there are 4 things of note depicted. First, the disputational nature of the medieval university. None of this silent obedience and blind faith sort of a thing. Rather, these guys here on this wall are really arguing. They're getting down to it with each other. Second, the importance of the Franciscans in that culture. Often, we don't necessarily think about the Franciscans as part of the intellectuals of the late Middle Ages, but they were. Third, the pan-European nature of medieval intellectual culture. Now, here in this church in northern Italy, these were not, by any means, all Italians. Even though the Franciscan order started in Italy, these were not all Italians on the wall. There were Irishmen, Frenchmen, Germans, Englishmen, and others. Finally, the thing that struck me perhaps most powerfully was that the church decided that it was appropriate to decorate the walls here not with canonized saints, not with biblical narratives, but rather with the Franciscan order's intellectuals. What does that choice say about their society, their culture, and their values? It does remind us, for example, of the enshrinement of the 7 liberal arts on the facade of the cathedral at Chartres. And certainly it's enough to warm the heart of any modern academic. So when you think of medieval theologians, medieval universities, think of this fresco. Well, in the next lecture, we're going to look at 2 topics of medieval natural philosophy, 2 topics that are widely misunderstood but were widely practiced in the Middle Ages, namely astrology and alchemy.